my fellow peanuts, and welcome to anyone who is new to the podcast or to my channel. Now, this podcast covers true crime cases that may not be suitable for young listeners. There may be graphic and violent content, so listener or viewer discretion has been advised. Welcome back, my fellow peanuts, and welcome to everyone. Episode 23. It's going to be a good one, guys. We're going to be talking about probably one of the most controversial serial killers of all time. Our state is Massachusetts, and our serial killer is Albert DeSalvo. He was otherwise known, as everybody is aware, I would hope that you all are aware, he was otherwise known as the Boston Strangler. Or was he? Now, we could debate for many, many hours as to whether he was innocent or guilty. There are some facts that lead to his possible innocence, I would say, but there are some facts that lead to him being possibly guilty. There's a lot of things that come into question, guys. However, for the purposes I'm thinking of this podcast, guys, we're going to assume he's actually guilty. And I will certainly be making my own observations like I always do. I don't know if this is going to be a fun fact or a really, really sad fact, but I did think I would share it before we start the podcast. Albert would actually never be found guilty in any of the Boston Strangler murders. This was largely due to a lack of evidence, but he would definitely leave behind a legacy, him being known as the Boston Strangler. Now, I'm a little fascinated by him, to be honest, so this is probably going to be, well, like they all are, interesting podcasts, and it's definitely a great episode. I hope you all enjoyed my little bit of my bloopers episode, or my little outtakes and stuff like that there. Guys, it does take a lot of work to do this, and sometimes it's just like, so I hope you all enjoyed it and had a little bit of fun. That is specific for my YouTubers. So I'm not going to debate his innocence, but I will say that I do sit in a situation where I think he may have committed some of these murders, but not all of them. So I think there might have been another serial killer in the area, or maybe sometimes that the deaths committed by Albert were more of an accident. So that's a little bit of my theory personally, but it's just an observation from what I've seen, guys. But we're going to start like we always do, so let's start at the beginning of Albert's life. Albert DeSalvo was born on September 3rd, 1931 in Chelsea, Massachusetts. His parents were Frank and Charlotte DeSalvo. He was one of 5 children, and there's absolutely nothing idyllic about his childhood. He would have some brothers and sisters. His dad was a sadistic and cruel man who would beat his own wife in front of his children. Now, I think some of the worst things that I've heard about Frank DeSalvo himself is he'd actually bring home sex workers, and he would have sex with them in front of his wife and also his children. There's a particularly violent episode that's mentioned more than once in quite a few articles and also in one documentary specifically. I think it's because Albert himself actually said it. One of the times that Frank was beating his wife in front of the kids, he would knock her teeth out and he would bend her fingers so far back that they all were broken. I can't imagine what that would do, witnessing that in your child's psyche. And I just don't know how you would function as an adult knowing this is what you had been exposed to as your most idyllic people, your parents. So this is what you're going to grow up and be like. It's certainly not a great example for a young child. But I'm not sure if this is true or not, but it is truly disturbing if it is. Frank would apparently sell his children for $9 to a local farmer, but thankfully those kids were smart enough and they would actually get away and make their way back home. But Albert was taught from a really young age from his dad specifically how to steal. At the age of 12, he would be arrested for battery and robbery. He would be sent to the Lyman School for Boys, and he'd be sent there again at the age of 15. But this time it had been for stealing a car. So once again, though, we're going to see a serial killer join the army, right? He would be arrested during his time in the army for sexually assaulting an underage girl, but her parents wouldn't actually end up going through those charges. Also during this time, while he was in the army, he would meet his future wife, Irmgard Beck, I believe is how you pronounce it. Now, after being discharged from the army, they would go on to marry and have 2 children. And honestly, all I can really say about that marriage is the kindest words that I can use is dysfunctional. So I'm just not truly dysfunctional. That's all I'm going to say. Between 1956 and 1960, he would be arrested multiple times for breaking and entering. He wouldn't receive any jail time during this period, just receive suspended sentences. Now, despite his run-ins with the law, he would always remain employed, which truly shocks me. But I'm guessing during that time and age, maybe they weren't doing criminal background checks. I'm just really not sure. But that's like, and your wife is still staying with you during this period where you're being arrested multiple times. Or is he not telling her? That's also a suspicion of mine. Now, the people who knew him would actually regard him as a devoted family man who would treat his wife with tenderness, and I'm guessing what's happening behind closed doors is perhaps not what he showed the world. Albert had an insatiable sexual appetite, and he'd demand sex up to 6 times a day from his wife. Now, after his 2 children were born, his wife was unable to sort of keep up with that insatiable demand. And I think this is where he would utilise other means to satisfy himself. They're gross and despicable ways. So, it was really quite revolting. But it always amazes me that serial killers seem so normal to the outside world. Again, I do suspect it's a fracturing of their personalities. We've seen it multiple times on multiple different episodes. They have that ability to show multiple faces to the world. It's just truly fascinating to me, guys. It's just food for thought, but it's really, really fascinating to me that one side is going out and killing these women and the other side is this endearing family man who loves his children and loves his wife. Now, we are going to be discussing the lead up to the Strangler murders, but there is, before we discuss the Boston Strangler murders, there's a little story of a criminal known as the Measuring Man. A series of strange events would start to take place in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I've got to tell you, this is a bit of a strange thing to do. And really, for me to even be talking about it, it's just a little odd. Like, in this day and age, I don't know if he would be able to do this, but hear me out. A man in his late 20s, he would knock on random doors. Now, if a young girl would answer, he would introduce himself and he would say that he worked for a modelling agency and he needed to take her measurements. Now, Albert would reassure them that he wasn't there for nefarious reasons, and he would tell them that the agency would like models for evening gowns and swimsuits. So he needed to take those measurements, and he would send them. Into his agency and propose that this girl become a model. Now, at times he would touch the women inappropriately, but not enough to really warrant them going to the police or even sort of put him on the police's radar at this stage. Now, after a while, some of those women would grow suspicious when no one would call them from this modelling agency, and they would end up reporting the incident to the police. Excuse me, I'm just going to take a sip of water. Now, it would happen to be a lucky break that would end up catching him. On March 17th in 1961, Albert would be caught trying to break and enter into the home. He would really quickly confess to the crime of breaking and entering, but he would also admit at the same time to being the Measuring Man. I think personally that Albert really liked the attention that he got when he confessed to crimes. So I think that's what pushed and drove him to talk about this so quickly. To me, I also think it's interesting that most serial killers enjoy the attention and they do seem to feed off it a lot. I'm guessing it has something to do with the narcissism. That, again, is just food for thought, guys. I'm not really sure if that's the case, but I do see a pattern very often where serial killers love to admit to their crimes and they love to get that attention on them. They love that the police are like, okay, tell me more about the crime. So that's just my thoughts. When the police actually asked him why he did it, he'd say, I'm not good looking, I'm not educated, and I was able to put something over on high class people. They were all college kids and I never had anything in my life and I outsmarted them. Now, it seems to me he seems a little bit resentful in this statement. But that's just my observation. But I'm quite shocked given his criminal history. The judge would actually order him only an 18-month sentence. He would be released from jail in April 1962. Now, this would just be 2 months shy of the Boston Strangler's first victim. Her name happened to be Anna Slessers. I think that's how you pronounce it, so I do feel really awful about pronouncing these people's names correctly, these victims. So from what I can gather from my research, there are 11 official known victims, and there's 2 additional that are possible. Now, of the 11 official victims, they are aged between, 6 of them, of the known victims, are aged between 55 and 75, and the other known victims, 5 of them, they were considerably a lot younger, at 18 to 23. The 2 possible victims, though, were aged 85 and 69. Now, that's quite a difference, but not something was sort of unheard of, right? Victimology does change in certain times, but it's unusual, but it does happen. I've seen it, and I think we've seen it a couple of times, not many times on the episodes, but I think we have seen a victimology change. Now, either it's a case of convenience or there was more than one serial killer, right, guys? But I'm guessing we're never going to really know, given that we'll get to that at the end of the podcast. That I don't think we're ever really going to know. Now, the Boston Strangler would kill his first victim on the 14th of June 1962. 55-year-old Anna Slessers. She was a divorcee. She had left Latvia with her son and daughter, and she would settle back in the Back Bay area once arriving in the US. She had very little income, and she worked as a seamstress, so she had about $60 per week. So she was living in a fairly moderate apartment by herself at the time of her death. Now, on the night that she was murdered, her 25-year-old son, Juris, would arrive at 7 p.m. to pick her up to take her to church service. There was no answer when he initially knocked, and he continued to knock, and at that stage he was starting to get really annoyed with her. But it really quickly turned into panic when his mum didn't come to the door. Like, there was just that overwhelming fear of something isn't right. My mum is very on time. She asked me to come here at 7 p.m. because she wanted to me to drop her at church. Now, he would break into her apartment, and what can only be described as a child's worst fear and worst nightmare, he would find his mum dead in the bathroom. Her bathroom robe was spread open with the cord tied around the neck. He would really quickly, as you can imagine, call the police, and they would rule out suicide pretty quickly after noticing that the body looked like it had been posed, and there were also indications of a sexual assault. I can't even imagine, for me, what that would have been like for him to find his mother that way. And I feel for that. I feel for him so much. The apartment looked like it had been ransacked, so the police would initially believe it was a burglary gone wrong. However, they would think that once the burglar had seen Anna, that his deviant behaviour somehow took over and he would sexually assault her, and that he had to kill her because she'd seen him. They would eventually find out and discover that this was that nothing had been stolen in the apartment, and this would contradict their initial thoughts. It was going to take some time, though, before the police would work out they had a serial killer in their midst. I don't think you can ever honestly know from the first moment this was going to be as bad as it was. I don't think you're ever going to understand that. I don't think it's possible that you know that was. Now, our next victim is actually considered a possible victim of the strangler, but Albert would actually confess to her murder. 2 weeks after Anna's murder, there was an 85-year-old lady by the name of Mary Mullen. Now, she would be found in her apartment, and Albert, during his confession, would actually say that he didn't kill her. He would admit that she had died after he allegedly either sexually assaulted her or he was going to. And her autopsy would even say that she had died of a heart attack. Now, I think the reason that Mary Mullen is a possible victim is that she wasn't posed and she wasn't strangled. So I suspect this is more due to the manner of her death, obviously. He didn't get his gratification or his satisfaction from her death. So I think that's the reason why there was no posing of her. Or maybe it was just a genuine accident. And this is possibly Albert's first murder, right? So I don't know. It's an interesting one. Because then we're going to go to the next 2 murders. Now, this would be just 2 days later. There would be 2 murders in one day, or 2 bodies found in one day. I'm not sure if they were killed on the same day. If Albert was the Boston Strangler, though, he was certainly escalating really, really fast. It was only 2 weeks between the alleged murder and the first murder and the second murder, and now 2 days later, 2 more bodies have been found. Now, I also suspect, though, that it was because Mary had died so unexpectedly. So there was a rage building up inside him. So I think that's possibly why there was 2 murders in one day, or that they were so close together. Our next victim is Nina Nichols. Now, she would be found on June 30th, 1962. She had been posed in a way to shock and to disgust the police. The police would also make note that it was her own stockings that had been used to strangle her. And like Anna, she actually had a bow tied around her neck. She would also show signs of a sexual assault. Now, it was becoming a little bit familiar now. You've got your second murder, and the place would appear once again to have been robbed. But once again, they'd also noticed that nothing had been taken. So they're sort of realising that there's a pattern between Anna and Nina at this stage. Now, then we do have the other victim that was found on the same day was Helen Blake. Now, you can see the picture in the background. Now, that shows a house. It's not it's now a one-family home, but previously she had been living there, and it was like a rent-a-room apartment house. So I imagine, personally, this is just me personally, I imagine that the house has been changed into that sort of family home in an attempt to hide the grisly murder that had once happened in that home. Or maybe it's just that we sort of don't have that need to have apartment room housing now. I don't know. But that was just a side note for you guys. Now, she had also been strangled, but it was a slightly different posing this time. She had her bra, and that had been used to tie as a bow. She was grotesquely posed, and she had been found to be sexually assaulted. This time, though, the killer had actually stolen 2 diamond rings. I will not get into the grotesqueness of how she was posed, because I don't think that's what anyone wants to hear or needs to hear. But I will say it was definitely upping the ante now on how he was posing his victims. Now, after the murder of Helen, the police commissioner, Edmund McNamara, he was suddenly becoming a little bit alarmed and a little bit concerned. A warning would go out to women in the Boston area to lock their doors, and you have to be extra vigilant and you have to be really wary of strangers. He cancelled all of the police's vacations and transferred all detectives to work for homicide. A thorough investigation was starting to build all sex offenders and violent former mental patients. They were looking for what they considered a madman, and one that had probably attacked older women because some form of hatred of his mother. Now, Edmund McNamara, he was a former FBI agent, and he would actually call on the Bureau to hold a seminar on sex crimes for his detectives so that they had a better understanding of it. I don't know if there was any correlation to the way that Albert possibly felt about his mum. I suspect there would have been some resentment for being exposed to that kind of environment by your dad, but I mean, again, guys, this is just food for thought. This is just my opinion. But after a cooling off period of about 2 months, the Boston Strangler would then next strike a victim of 75-year-old by the name of Ida Berger. Now, she would be a widow, and similar to the other victims, there was no sign of any forced entry, and she had been posed with a bow, and she'd been sexually assaulted. Now, within 24 hours of Ida, a 67-year-old nurse by the name of Jane Sullivan, she was killed in her apartment. Now, it was just across town from where Ida lived. Now, she had been dead for some days before she had actually been found. So, just so you're aware, in the videos in the background, I've put up maps before all the victims' photos, the photos that I could find, guys, of where they were in correlation. So you'll be able to see a little bit of a map. Now, the police would find Jane on her knees in her bathtub, and she had been strangled by her own stockings, possibly in the kitchen, they thought, or the bedroom. There was some blood found on the floors. They couldn't confirm that she had been sexually assaulted because she was so badly decomposed. However, there were blood stains on a broom. I'm not going to get into the instruments that are used during their sexual assaults, so just be aware that there was blood on a broom. There was no signs of forced entry again. The apartment didn't happen to look like a burglary this time, but her purse would be found open. So this is where we're going to see a change in that victimology. I'll say it again though, guys. I know that it can change because I've seen it before in other serial killers. This one is quite strange, like the massive age difference. And there was also a change in race for one of these victims. Now, I think I touched on it before, but I'm wondering whether it was a convenience thing, whether it was an access thing. It's really one of those things that I go, you can't rule it out that it would be the same person. You really can't rule it out. But it does raise that question in my head that whether there was 2 active serial killers at the time. And look, it's entirely plausible 2 serial killers are acting in the same environment because we've seen it before. We saw it in Louisiana. We have seen it in California. It happened all the time in California. It is insane how many active serial killers. And I think I heard a statistic on a documentary the other day. It is known that there's at least 2 active serial killers in an area at any given time. It is truly appalling. Woo! I'm so glad I live in Australia. That's all I'm going to say. Getting back to our podcast though, guys. On December 5th, 1962, Sophie Clark, she was a popular 21-year-old. She happened to be African-American, and she was a student at the Carnegie Institute of Medical Technology. Now, she had been found by her 2 roommates. She had, so her apartment was in the Back Bay area, and she was just a couple of blocks from Anna, the first victim's apartment. Now, she was also posed in a grotesque fashion in her living room, and she had been strangled by 3 of her stockings, and they were tied really, really tightly around her neck. She also had a part of her slip also tied around her neck. There was definitely indications of a sexual assault, and there would be semen found near her body. So we are seeing a really strong pattern here, guys, that he is escalating. He is posing them in far more grotesque fashion. So this is where you start to see some pretty big jumps and leaps on how the victims, how different and how much more hurt they are going forward. With Sophie, there's no signs of forced entry again. She was really security conscious though, and she had insisted on having a second lock in the apartment after hearing about Boston Strangling. So she was cautious. So she would always ask people before letting them into the house. Yet somehow this killer had managed to make their way into her apartment. Now, she had really struggled with the Boston Strangler. The killer had actually rummaged through drawers in her apartment and examined her collection of classical records. So it seems like he took a little bit more time with Sophie in this time around, and he knew he could take this time, right? So it indicates that they're possibly being watched and possibly being stalked. But with this murder, there were some differences that there wouldn't be at the other murders. As I mentioned before, whilst there's a change in victimology, Sophie was an African American. She was young and she had roommates. And also, for the first time, there was evidence of semen at the scene of the crime. So this is what I was talking about before. There's escalation, all right? He's getting a little bit more careless. Or maybe it's because of the fact that he's gotten away with it each time. Yeah, so he's gotten that little bit more confidence. And when police questioned the neighbours, there would be a Mrs. Marcella Lulka, who lived in the same building. She mentioned that around 2 p.m, a man had knocked on her door and said that the super had sent him about painting her apartment. He then told her that he'd have to fix the bathroom ceiling, and he ended up complimenting her on her figure. And he would actually say, "Have you ever thought about modelling?" This is showing signs to me of the measuring man. So this is where I think it's hard not to think that it's not Albert, but I'm not really sure. Now, she would end up putting a finger to her lips and he became quite angry. His character would change completely. She just noticed a real change in him. Now, she would actually say, "My husband is sleeping in the next room." He would then say to her, "Oh, crap, I've got the wrong apartment," and left really quickly. Now, she described him as being somewhere between 25 and 30 years old, average height, honey-coloured hair, wearing a dark jacket and dark green trousers. Remember the dark green trousers, guys, because we are going to come back to that shortly. 3 weeks after the murder of Sophie, there would be 23-year-old Patricia Bissett. Now, she happened to be a secretary for a Boston engineering firm, and she would be found on New Year's Eve, so December 31st in 1962. Now, her boss had actually become quite worried when she didn't arrive at work, so he would end up going around to her apartment, her apartment building, and it's also located near Anna's house and where Sophie lived as well. Now, her apartment was locked, so her boss, with the help of one of the custodians, he would end up climbing through a window into the apartment. Again, guys, I just want to point out, these people, they did not know what they were walking into, right? They had no idea that they were walking into an absolute nightmare. She would end up being found with her face in her bed with the covers drawn up to her chin. It actually ended up like she was taking a bit of a nap. So Underneath the covers, though, she'd be found lying there with several stockings knotted and interwoven with a blouse that had been tied around her neck. So another bow, and there was once again indications of sexual assault. She was in the early stage of pregnancy as well, and there had been some damage to her rectum as well. It just adds further insult to injury when you hear that someone is pregnant, right? It just really indicates to me that there's just a level of decorum. I am positive if she knew she was pregnant, she would have been begging for the life of her child. That would be what things were really quiet for a couple of months, though. Police took the opportunity to reinvestigate and look for any clue that they could link any of these people together, right? Any of the victims, any person that they may have known, they may have met, any place that they've sort of visited or that they're shocked. All the usual, criminals and suspects were investigated, but they still couldn't find any links or men that seemed to fit the bill. So sorry. So we pop into early March 1963 now. Now that was, we now go to 25 miles north of Boston, a little place called Lawrence, and 68-year-old Mary Brown was found beaten to death in her apartment, but she'd also been strangled and raped. I believe Mary Brown is the other possible murder, not an official. The next murder was 2 months later, and a change to a manner of death would occur this time as well. We're going to get to as to why shortly as well. Now, this particular murder, we're going to head back to Boston on May 8, 1963. Beverly Simons, a 23-year-old graduate student, she would miss choir practice, and her friend would end up going to the apartment and opened her the key that she had actually given him. The moment he opened up that door, he would be faced again with something no friend should actually say. Like, again, the shock that they are at the posed ways these victims are just, he's just gone for shock value. Whoever the murderer is, whether it be Albert, whether it be someone else, he's going for that shock. She would lay directly in front of him on a sofa bed. Now, her legs had been spread apart. Her hands had been tied behind her with one of her scarves. A nylon stocking and 2 handkerchiefs were tied together and were tied in a bow around her neck. Over her mouth, a cloth had actually been placed, and underneath it, a second cloth had actually been stuffed into her mouth. Now, while at first it will appear that she had been strangled, and she had in fact been strangled, she'd also been stabbed. She would endure 22 stab wounds in total. It's 18 of them were to her left breast. That's a lot of anger. That's a lot of anger in one movement. A lot of anger. Now, the ligature around her neck in particular was all for show, and it wasn't tied tightly enough to strangle her. But the bloody knife would be found in her kitchen sink. Now, she had not been raped by any man or object, and there was no signs of sin around. But it had been estimated that she had probably been dead for about 48 to 72 hours. Now, she was studying to be an opera singer, and she had actually planned to try out for the Met in New York later that year. Police would actually speculate that because of this singing, she'd actually developed some very strong throat muscles that may have made it very hard for the Boston Strangler to actually strangle her to death. And that's what ended up resulting in the stabbing. And I think that made him really angry. I think the fact that he couldn't get his gratification, it just seemed to spur him on. this is where I'm talking about, guys. It's that need to escalate. So we've seen an escalation in the last couple of murders. Now, there would be no known murders in the summer of 1963. However, in September 1963, the Boston Strangler would make an ugly return. This time, he returned to killing older ladies. It would be in Salem, and Evelyn Corbin, a 58-year-old lady, had been found dead. Now, she had also been strangled with two of her stockings, and her underwear had been stuffed into her mouth. Her bed had been marked with lipsticks and tissues, and that contained traces of semen. Bed sheets contained semen. One strange clue, though, that was found at the scene was an uneaten donut outside of her window on the fire escape. Now, police had determined that it was not grown there by any of the residents after questioning all of those neighbours. So they knew full well that someone had been obviously out on that fire escape and had dumped that donut. Our last two known victims are young as well, and these are the last known victims of the Boston Strangler. So we've got 23-year-old Joanne Graff. Now, she was found to be raped and murdered in her apartment that had been ransacked, and that was on the 25th of November in 1963. Now, this also happened to be around the time that the nation was actually mourning the death of JFK. Very, very sad. Two nylon stockings were wrapped really tightly around her neck, and they were shaped in a bow as well. And there were very clear bite marks that were seen on her chest. There would be blood stemming from the sexual assault, and it would be pretty horrible what she had to endure. But earlier that day, Joanne's upstairs neighbour, Kenneth Rowe, he'd received a knock on his door and he would answer, and a man dressed in green slacks and a dark shirt and a jacket, and he actually asked if this was the apartment of Joanne Graff. The neighbour would end up redirecting that man to Joanne's actual apartment, and he would leave quite quickly. This is what makes me think there is a possibility that he is actually stalking his victims, considering the fact that he knows their names. I don't know if it's he knows where they live, but he certainly knows their names, which is terrifying. Now, the last known victim would be found by her two roommates as well. This would be 19-year-old Mary Sullivan, and she was found on the 4th of January 1964. Mary had been strangled like the others, and she had a pink and black stocking that was wrapped low underneath her chin. This part, and I truly apologise, is absolutely awful. So the Boston Strangler, if you ever hear me in any way, shape, or form, you are truly appalled. A Happy New Year's card was placed against her feet. Her body had been positioned in an upright manner, and there was visible semen around her mouth and all over her chest. In just a final act of true depravity, just absolutely revolting, he had used a door to pose the victim. I'm not going to say where. Use your imagination. But just absolutely appalling. So in parallel to the Boston Strangler murders, the police were on high alert about another guy. He was the criminal known as the Green Man. He'd begun a crime spree in Boston, and then he moved around all sorts of areas in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. Now, the police would believe that the Green Man, whose nickname comes from the green clothes he'd wear while committing his crimes. He committed more than, I believe it was 400 burglaries and had sexually assaulted up to 300 women. Now, while the task force was investigating the Boston Strangler, one was also looking for the Green Man. So you've got the victims and the neighbours have also indicated that a man that was wearing green is in those photos. So this is where I go, ooh, hang on, maybe he was. So in early November 1964, almost 3 years after he'd been released from jail, Albert DeSalvo is arrested again. This time, the charges were far more serious than breaking and entering and those measuring man antics he got to. On October 27, 1964, a woman was lying in her bed and she just dozed off just shortly after her husband had left for work. And suddenly there was a man in her room, put a knife to her throat and said, "Not a sound, or I will kill you." He would stuff her underwear in her mouth and he would tie her to the bedposts with her own clothes. He kissed her, he bundled her, and then he asked her how to get out of the apartment. "You be quiet for 10 minutes," was what he said. And finally, he would end up actually apologising and leave the apartment. She got a really, really good look at his face. The police sketch would remind them of who they could recall as the measuring man. The man that we're talking about that just broke into that apartment doesn't strike me as the same as the man who is tying bows and is extremely violent. So that's where I sit on the fence a little bit with this one, guys. But they would bring Albert to the station where she was able to, where the victim was able to observe him through a two-way mirror. Absolutely no doubt about it. She knew it straight away. That's him. He was released on bail, though. His photo, though, would routinely come up on the police network, and soon calls were coming in from Connecticut, and they realised that he was also sexually assaulting victims in Connecticut. The same man, the Green Man. So police would end up arresting him at his home and arranged really quickly for the victims, the ones that had reported the crimes, I might add, guys, to identify him as quickly as possible. He was apparently mortified when his wife actually saw him taken away in handcuffs. His wife was not surprised, I'm told. He was absolutely obsessed with sex, and no one woman would ever be good enough, was what she said. In fact, the Green Man had assaulted 4 women in one day in 4 different towns in Connecticut. And his wife told him to be completely truthful and not to hold anything back. And this is where it gets really, really interesting, guys. He would admit to breaking into 400 apartments and a couple of rapes. Apparently, he said he assaulted somewhere between 300 and 350 women. He didn't indicate, though, that he'd sexually assaulted them. It was only after a lot of prodding that he actually admitted to that. And given his tendency to exaggerate, though, it was difficult to actually tell if that number was really that high. Many of the instances, as you can imagine, during that time had gone unreported, and in fact, the women were very reluctant at the time to describe what had happened to them. It was a time where you often weren't believed if something more happened to you. So I can understand why women were not coming forward. He would be sent to Bridgewater State Hospital for observation, and while the police did not believe that he could be the strangler, they wanted to actually get a psychiatrist to just examine. So they were already sort of sitting on that fence of, is he the Boston Strangler, right? So he's on their radar. Now, shortly after he arrived at Bridgewater, he would meet a man by the name of George Nasser. Now, he had also become an inmate. He'd been charged with an absolutely horrible and vicious murder of a gas station attendant. He was no ordinary person. He had an IQ of almost or at genius level, and his ability to manipulate people was really, really high. So while he's in prison for an earlier murder, he had actually been studying Russian and other subjects. So he ended up being put in the same ward or same room as Albert. There's like mixed messages about that, but he would end up becoming Albert's confidant. Now, there's multiple reports that they had come up with a plan to share the reward money, the information on the Boston Strangler. Now, Albert would actually tell NASA, and George would tell his attorney, F. Lee Bailey, that he was the Boston Strangler, that Albert had admitted that he was the Boston Strangler. Now, this is where I get really confused, because somewhat I think they were comparing notes, and I think possibly they were both murderers. Now, George would say that he was convinced by his description of the crimes, he was getting it off his chest, and I was the first person apparently to who he'd really spoken to about all of the specifics of his crimes. George Nassar immediately reports this all to F. Lee Bailey, and by the way, F. Lee Bailey was O.J. Simpson's attorney. But on March 6, 1965, Albert DeSalvo ends up formally confessing to being the Boston Strangler. He said that he had killed 11 of the suspected victims, as well as 85-year-old Erin Mullen. But she had been found in her home, but he would say that she died in his arms. 13 victims, and you don't know, he couldn't quite recall all the details. So, there was definitely some inconsistencies. Like, if you read through some of it, it's really inconsistent. But the police were actually satisfied that he was a strangler. And very, very sticky legal issues had to be resolved before any type of trial could be held. But basically, his confession was considered inadmissible as evidence. So F. Lee Bailey would say about the situation in itself that when I met Albert, there were enough indictments pending against him to pretty much ensure that he would never be walking the streets ever again. Now I've helped him disclose that he's committed multiple murders. It's with a certainty that he'll never be released. Show me some way to avoid the risk of execution, and I'll run the risk of conviction, but not execution. And you can have anything you want to know, anything you want. I know damn well that neither of you really wants to see him killed. Tell me, is that asking too much? So he would actually talk to the prosecutor, and he would actually say all of that to the prosecutor. Fascinates me though, because it's a real strange one, but obviously did not want to be convicted, right? Didn't want his client to be convicted. But finally, on January 10th, 1967, Albert was tried on the Green Man charges. The strategy behind his defence was the basic strategy by which I hoped to convince a jury that Albert, not guilty by reason of insanity, was pretty simple. I would attempt to use the 13 murders he had committed as the Boston Strangler to show the extent of his insanity. To do this, I would try to get both his confession and its corroboration by police into evidence. Certainly the problem was usual. I wanted the right to defend a man for robbery and assault by proving that he had committed 13 murders. Definitely an interesting approach, if you ask me. I'm not sure I would have gone with it, but I like it. Like he's saying, hey, he's committed all these murders, so he's obviously got to be insane. And that's why he did the rapes and the breaking and entering. So the prosecution would basically say he wasn't insane, And he would say that he was very sane because Albert had the ability to jimmy his way in or con his way into the apartment verbally. He'd end up tying up the victim, he would strip her, he'd fondle her, demand oral sex, but he stopped short of rape at times. He used a knife or a toy gun to ensure that he had their full cooperation. After he was done, he would end up taking money and jewellery from the victims. F. Bailey wouldn't end up cross-examining the victims because he just didn't think there was anything to gain by it. So, and I sort of see the logic behind that, right? Because he's already admitted to it. So you can't deny that he has done these crimes. So he's just, F. Bailey is basically saying whether he could prove that he was not insane at the time. And he would bring on some experts saying that he was paranoid schizophrenic. He would say that Albert knew what he was doing was wrong. But his Green Man crimes were a result of a irresistible impulse, which, again, he seemed to be able to con his way into apartments, though, and talk his way into apartments. He knew to use a weapon to get them to, do what they want, do what he needed them to do. So, realistically, I don't think he was insane. I think there were parts of him that weren't entire, that probably needed some real help. Look, the jury didn't believe him. They'd find him guilty on all counts and they'd sentence him to life in prison. The psychiatric help that F. Bailey so dearly wanted was denied. And he was really, really angry because he said, my goal was to see the Strangler wind up in a hospital where doctors could try and find out what made him ill. Society is deprived of a study that might help deter others, who deter other mass killers who lived among us, waiting for the trigger to go off inside. Now, my favourite, John E. Douglas, the former FBI special agent who was one of the first criminal profilers, he actually doubted that Albert DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler. In his book, The Cases That Haunt Us, he identified Albert DeSalvo as a power assurance motivated rapist. He said that such a rapist is unlikely to kill in the manner of the crimes attributed to Boston Strangler. A power assurance motivated rapist would, however, be prone to taking reckless crimes. In November 1973, Albert was actually stabbed to death by a fellow inmate. Anything else we were going to ever find out about the Boston Strangler, it died with him. If we really needed to know anything at all, right? Definitely there's a lot of people that speculate his confession was false. And many speculate that it's actually George Nassar that managed to convince him to, confess, which, look, it wouldn't surprise me. It really, really wouldn't. It's definitely an interesting concept, right? But he actually had a really, really violent death, and if he was the Boston Strangler, kind of earned it, as far as I'm concerned. But thank you all for watching and listening to episode 23. If you like this podcast, please hit that like button and that subscribe button. Go ahead and listen to other episodes if this is your first one you're listening to. Have a great weekend, my fellow peanuts, and I will see you all next time. Thank you.